Very pleased to be here. It's my first time in Pittsburgh, and I've been having a wonderful week, speaking to many different groups. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. To speak to you on the subject of, do Black Lives Matter, the effect of mass incarceration on the individual and on the community. First of all, I must begin by saying that Black lives have never mattered in this country. That's not hype. That's not a statement that's intended to sensationalize the subject. If it is offensive, so be it. It's a simple statement of fact. It is the truth about events as opposed to interpretation. It is a specific elements, circumstances, certainty, reality, something that is known to have happened that actually exists. It is a fact. It is particulars that can be proved. A thing that is indisputably the case. So I say it again. Black lives have never mattered in America. The millions of bone fragments that line the ocean floor, lives lost in the horrific transatlantic slave trade, centuries of oppression, exploitation, death and destruction, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, decades of recorded and unrecorded lynchings, segregation, redlining, the Civil War, the battle for civil rights, COINTELPRO, the systematic flow of government-sanctioned drugs and guns into black communities, legislative actions and rulings, from the Dred Scott case to the crack law, from 3/5 of a man to 100 times the sentence. Black lives have never mattered in America. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney of the U.S. Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision handed down on March 6, 1857, said, in the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who have been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they have become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorial instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. From the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, it is clear that black lives did not matter. Mass incarceration is the outgrowth of slavery. It is the stepchild of slavery. It is a natural progression of a system that was designed to crush the soul and spirit of Africans here in America. On January 31st, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution and later ratified it on December 6th. This amendment was purportedly written to abolish slavery in the United States. Yet, listen to the wording of this amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall, having been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery in the United States. It merely transformed the power to enslave Africans from fortresses, ships, plantations, and auction blocks to police stations, courthouses, chain gangs, and cell blocks. With the passing of this amendment, the roots of mass incarceration were firmly woven into the tapestry of American society. Mass incarceration is the natural progression of slavery. We have to understand that. It is the son of slavery. Jim Crow and the black codes as a system never respected the voices of black people, the lives of black people, nor our aspirations for the present or the future. It never saw us as human beings fit to be on an equal footing with white society. Mass incarceration made it a crime to be black in America. And the legal system was used as a control mechanism, a social and an economic tool to continue the oppression and the suppression of the African population. Oftentimes in what is called third world nations, we speak of the disappeared ones, those who have disappeared into the maw of dictatorships, totalitarian regimes, hundreds of thousands of the missing individuals never to be seen again. Yet in the world of Africans in America, via mass incarceration, there have always been the disappeared ones. Whole generations swallowed up by the justice system, serving life sentences for many, many years, while their communities suffer, their families fragment, their children grow up, or their parents grow old. How can we as a country purport to be the beacon of democracy, the light of the civilized world, the leader of free societies, when we boast the highest incarceration rate on the planet? We must look at mass incarceration clearly and call it what it is: a system for control and oppression of Africans in America, a system that limits the birth rate, the growth and wealth of urban populations, and stills the voices of those who would oppose the system, and it provides industry and commerce for white rural America. Let's look at the prison population in the U.S. There are 1,574,000 people in state and federal prison, 731,200 in county jails, 853,200 on parole, 3,910,300 on probation, meaning that in the United States there are 7,041,700 persons under the control of mass incarceration. If we use the standard of 60% of this population being black, you're talking about 4.2 million people. In the census of 1860, there were 3,953,760 slaves in the upper and the lower South. That means there are more African Americans now in this country, in this system of mass incarceration, than there were slaves in 1860. That is a daunting statistic. So what we're looking at is structural racism, racism that's embedded in the heart of our society, and the challenge of black America and of white American citizens who acknowledge white privilege, who acknowledge the imprint of the system, and those who seek to work on behalf of truth, justice, and human rights. But in order to truly understand mass incarceration, we have to look at the underlying reasons that mass incarceration exists and it thrives. The first element is financial. Mass incarceration is an $80 billion a year business. Understand that. $80 billion a year is generated by mass incarceration. Mass incarceration has actually replaced manufacturing in America, and in many rural communities, mass incarceration is the economy. Whole towns are built around the prison system. Many companies in this country use the slave labor of prisoners to create their products, to deliver their services, and to enhance their profit. What is the major component of any large industrial complex or industry? Their labor force. That's their largest single expense. But if you command a labor force where the salaries begin at 16 or 22 cents an hour, you are guaranteed a sizable return on your investment. And that is the reality of the mass incarceration prison labor system. When I worked in Unicorn Federal Industries, I started at 22 cents an hour. Then I went to 44 cents, then 66 cents, then 88 cents, and the top grade was $1.27. And you could make $200 to $300 a month if you worked hard and you had overtime. That is slave labor. So the reality is, due to the 13th Amendment, slavery exists in this country. Slavery was never abolished. It simply exists behind the walls of prisons. We also must look at mass incarceration as a control mechanism, a societal form of social, racial, and political control. The wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, clearly points out that mass incarceration has created an entire class of second-class citizens. Because you are denied so many of the rights of citizens once you have been through the system of mass incarceration. In terms of political control, you can no longer vote. Over 20 million people in this country are disenfranchised and are not allowed to vote. In only 13 states and the District of Columbia can you walk out of prison doors and vote. All of the other states have varying mechanisms which you have to go through in order to vote. In the state of New Jersey, next door to us, you have to be off parole or off probation, and you have to have paid off all of your fines. For many people, this is a daunting proposition. When I came home from the feds, I owed $30,000, and I still owe quite a bit of money because I'm paying monthly. I will likely be paying that for the rest of my life unless I just decide to one day, if I get some money, to pay it off. But the reality is, if I lived in New Jersey, I could not vote because I still owed fines or a sum of money to the government. You can't serve on a jury, which means that you cannot impact the criminal justice system. And who better to have a say in who goes to prison than those who have been in prison and who understand the trauma of being incarcerated. In terms of employment, it is extremely difficult to find employment once you have been incarcerated. In the Center for Returning Citizens, which is the organization that I run, we look for employment for persons who are coming out of incarceration. And let me tell you, it is a serious proposition to convince employers to employ people who have a criminal background. In terms of housing, if you live in an urban area and you come home from prison and your family lives in public housing, you cannot join in that housing. You are not allowed to live with your family. So you must establish a residence apart from that, and oftentimes that adds to the difficulty of transition when you have people who are trying to come home, do the right thing, and reintegrate with their family, but they're not even allowed to live with their family. And if they stay overnight at their family's house, they're endangering their family's residence. The right to bear arms is thought to be a fundamental part of the American mentality. But once you've been incarcerated, you can no longer bear arms, you can no longer defend your family, you can no longer own a gun, and it's an automatic 5-year penalty if you are caught. Mass incarceration is a reflection of the dominant culture of America. And we must understand that white supremacy is the accepted mode of culture in America. And white privilege is not acknowledged as the reality of America. And it is so insidious, it is so seemingly invisible while it influences life on all levels. And this allows mass incarceration to thrive in America without being questioned or opposed for what it really is. It's there and we don't even seem to see it. Mass incarceration is also due to the outgrowth of created conditions in urban and suburban neighborhoods where high crime rates generate bodies that feed the system. And yes, the argument can be made that there are high crime rates in these areas, and that's why people get incarcerated. But you must look at the underlying conditions, and you must examine the conditions that create criminal behavior, not just the symptoms of that behavior. So you're talking about deliberate legislative, judicial, and governmental decisions that negatively impact communities of color. Where are hazardous waste refineries located? Where are factories that spew pollution? When road projects are created that dislocate people, often it is in communities of color. There are so many. If you look back in history and you look at I was in Harrisburg not long ago at a Pennsylvania Council of Churches symposium on mass incarceration. And there was a wonderful professor there from the University of Pennsylvania. And he gave a very moving presentation on how throughout the rise of the middle class of America, as roads were being constructed, as 95, the Turnpike, and many of these major projects were being done, they were located through black communities, and these people were dispersed. And that is the history of our nation. So it's lack of opportunity, lack of jobs, substandard housing, and a sense of helplessness in combating this situation. You must also look at the influx of guns and drugs into our community, the marketing of alcoholic beverages, the influence of the media and music on the mind of our youth, and the huge profits generated in this effort. We don't think about that when we think about mass incarceration. We separate criminal justice from the conditions that create crime and that lead to mass incarceration. When you influence the mind of an entire generation of young people with gangster mentalities, I'm not just talking about hip hop. In American culture, gangsterism is revered. What is one of the all-time favorite movies of many, many people? The Godfather 1 and 2. Because we revere crime, we revere gangsterism, and in reality, America was built on gangsterism. Who were bigger gangsters than the Pilgrims? For all those who came in that wake and gangstered the land from the natives of this country. We're a violent culture. We're a gun culture. We are a gangster culture. Yet, we turn around and in our courts and in mass incarceration, we punish those who have fed into the culture which is America. Mass incarceration is also the direct result of substandard educational systems in urban areas. The school to prison pipeline, which is real, it's not a myth, it is real, and we see it every day in our neighborhoods. And the juvenile justice system, which needs to be totally overhauled. In our country, 50% of our juvenile facilities are prisons for hire. And what does that mean? That means there's profit to be made in locking up juveniles, which is why we had the Luzerne County scandal, where judges were actually being paid to incarcerate young people and send them into the juvenile system. In 2014, I was a part of Incarcerate PA, and we marched from Philadelphia to Harrisburg to protest the closing of 23 Philadelphia high schools and the allocation of $600 million to the Graterford Phoenix 1, Phoenix 2 prison complex. That's a clear indication that those in power in our government favored incarceration over education. For when you close schools in urban areas, what are you saying? That educating these people is not of importance. And when you expand the prison system, you're actually saying if you're not educated, then we have somewhere for you to go. The impact upon individuals, families, and communities is deadly. In our community, 60% of our households are headed by single black females. And this is due to the high incarceration rate among black males, as well as murder, drug addiction, and also failure to shoulder the responsibilities of fatherhood and caregiving, sometimes due to the aforementioned conditions, sometimes because that is the mindset, and that's the culture that we have created for ourselves. An estimated 1.7 million children in the U.S. have a parent in prison, according to a report from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Millions more have a parent in county jail. And that's not even the stat that they keep. 81,000 children in the state of Pennsylvania have a parent in state prison. This doesn't count federal prison or county jails. 65% of the male prisoners in the Department of Corrections have one or more children. That's 31,371 fathers. 72% of female prisoners in the Department of Corrections have one or more children. That's 1,795 mothers. African American youth are 7 times more likely than white youth and nearly 3 times as likely as Hispanics to have a parent in prison. Children of an incarcerated parents suffer higher risks of coping with depression, substance abuse, anxiety, and behavioral problems at home and at school. They share the stigma of having an incarcerated parent. They have to handle the anxiety and fear of whether that parent is safe, because prison is not a safe place to live. They struggle with not being able to touch and see their parent. And that's a part of human nature, a part of the joy of parenthood and being a parent. To be able to see and touch and hold and love your child. And often it's very difficult to maintain a relationship with an absent parent. I can attest to that because I spent 25 years of incarceration, and the last 18 years that I spent was extremely difficult on my children. It was extremely difficult to raise children from behind bars. And it takes a toll on the relationship. I have 4 daughters and a son. I have good relationships with 3 of my daughters. My youngest daughter, our relationship is a little shaky. That's because she's, a wild child also. My son and I have serious functioning problems because he truly believes in his heart, and rightly so, that his life would have been so different had I been home. And he's right. And it's very difficult for him to move past that. Even though I've been home 6 years and I've tried to create a relationship and move him forward in certain ways, he's resistant because he's still hanging on to the fact that for the greater part of his life, I was not there. And that trauma that he endured stays with him. And maybe at some point in his life, we'll move past that. That's my hope. But the possibility is maybe we will not. And that's what mass incarceration does. It separates parents from their children sometimes for life. Mass incarceration truly affects children and families and communities. Another aspect of mass incarceration that is often not discussed is the impact upon the aging in prison and their communities. The number of sentenced state and federal prisoners that are aged 65 and older grew at 94 times the rate of the overall prison population between 2007 and 2010. The number of sentenced prisoners aged 55 and older grew at 6 times the rate between 1995 and 2010. While serving time in prison, trust me, is hard on everyone. It is particularly challenging for the growing number of older prisoners who are frail, have mobility, learning, or vision impairments, and are suffering from chronic, disabling, or terminal illnesses, and they have diminished cognitive capacities. 1 in 10 state prisoners is serving life sentence. In our organization and our activist community, we don't call it life sentence because language is extremely important. We call it death by incarceration because that's what it is. And when you name something for what it is, you give power to that idea. So when you fight against it, you are fighting against that concept. We are fighting so that there will be no death by incarceration sentence. When you say someone must spend their entire life in prison, what you are saying is that you do not believe in redemption. You do not believe in second chances. You do not believe that a person can become a better person, that they can change, they can transform themselves, and they can grow. 11% of federal prisoners age 51 and older are serving sentences ranging from 30 years to life, and there is no parole for life in the Fed system. When you're in the Fed system and you get life, it is forever. For old or for a frail person, the right to safe conditions of confinement means not having to live in a dorm or a block with younger persons who are prone to violence and extortion. Many times in a prison situation, the younger prisoners will respect the older prisoners and they will take care of them if they're from their hood or they're from their city or they're the same culture. But many older prisoners get preyed upon by those who are in prison. It also means the right to decent conditions while they are incarcerated, receiving extra blankets, warm clothes, age-appropriate educational, recreational, or vocational facilities. It means for those who are mobility impaired, having a bottom bunk or having handicap access, and many times prisons are just not geared for them because they aren't built for old people. Yet when you give someone mandatory minimum sentences, when you give them life sentences, you are guaranteeing an older population as you move forward in time. So when we look at mass incarceration, we need to look at not only why it exists, but what we can do to transform it. We have to talk about restorative justice. Also, many elderly prisoners are being unnecessarily held in prison despite the fact that their continued incarceration does very little to serve the purpose of punishment. And again, we go with language, words, punishment. That's what the system of mass incarceration is about. Our system of justice is not restorative, it is punishment. So we're talking about retribution, incapacitation, and deterrence. And we're not talking about rehabilitation. We're not talking about transformation. We're not talking about holistic systems that seek to change the underlying problems that a person has that they came to prison for in the first place. If you do not work on those problems, then you guarantee that that person will be back again because he hasn't changed. He's still the same person that he was when he first went in. We don't look at alternative forms of punishment, especially for older prisoners who should be released after a certain amount of time, because the statistics say that the older you are, the less chance you have of coming back to prison. So when we talk about mass incarceration for older prisoners, we need to review and modify sentences and policies to reduce the growing population of older prisoners without risking public safety. We need to develop comprehensive plans for housing, for medical care, and for programs for the projected population of older prisoners. And we need to modify rules that impose unnecessary hardship on these prisoners. There's a wonderful organization in New York City, and the brother who runs it is a good friend of mine. His name is Mujahid Fareed, and it's called RAP, Release Aging People in Prisons. And he sent out a press release this morning. I'd like to read it to you. It says, RAP mourns the passing of elder Black Panther political prisoner Abdullah Majid in 5 Points Prison. Majid was 67 years old and had served 34 years in prison, and his continued incarceration made no sense. He was among the more than 9,500 elders behind New York prison bars, grievously injuring public health and wellness for families and communities across the state. His mentorship of younger incarcerated men is only one of the many reasons he will be deeply missed. Our condolences go out to his mother, Ms. LaRose Labordi, now 91 years old, and to his entire family and community. This sort of press release can be replicated hundreds of and thousands of times across the country. There are so many older prisoners who are mentors, who are teachers, who are instructors of younger prisoners, especially those who came into the prison system for the political reasons they are political prisoners. I was mentored by Dr. Matul Shakur, who is a wonderful example of an African elder. He's the stepfather of Tupac Shakur and the co-founder of the New African Nation. And for 12 years, I was honored and blessed to work with him in mentoring and instructing thousands of young men during the time that we spent time together in USP Lewisburg, USP Atlanta, and USP Cole. And that example is replicated all across the country, especially by many lifers who know they will never come home, and yet they have a transfer in their lives, and they view their responsibility to instruct young men so that they will never return to prison. We work with a organization of lifers in Graterford called Real Street Talk. And these brothers are so dynamic, and they formed such a relationship with the Department of Corrections in Graterford that Graterford is the prison that everyone